not all the way to the moon and back as others have claimed.
The moon probes were observed with a 50-foot radio telescope which at the frequency used, 2,300 MHz, had a beam width of 58 degrees. In round terms, this allowed us to pick up signals from up to about 1,000 miles above the moon's surface, although small corrections had to be made to the pointing as the probes orbited the moon. Voice signals were received from both the orbiting spacecraft and the lunar lander of good quality, but television signals were only picked up from the spacecraft on the surface of the moon. As we were not actively involved in the tracking of these craft, we did not track them after they had left the moon.
Now, in the same video, I responded to an anti-moon hoax article on Wikipedia, which claimed to the contrary. The article reads, Soviet unmanned craft had been landing on the moon since 1959, and in 1962, deep space tracking facilities were introduced at IP-15 in Usarisk and IP-16 in Neva Proctoria, while Saturn communication stations were added to IP-3, 4 and 14, the latter having a 100 million kilometer range. This statement was written in response to a claim by Bart Jodrell. The Soviets did not have the capability to track deep spacecraft until 1972. Jodrell's statement seemed to be along the same lines as what we were told on the BBC series, that Russia lacked the ability to track their own probes to the moon. Because viewers would most likely refer to this passage on Wikipedia, it felt necessary to address it in my Exhibit D series, which I did. However, being the selective editor as usual, Webb tries to turn this around and imply that I'm contradicting myself. Wikipedia and Encyclopedia Astronautica both state that in 1962, the USSR had constructed their own 52-foot antenna with a 100 million kilometer range. But what they fail to list are the frequencies that these stations used. According to 7 Gran of the Swedish space program, the downlinks for the old Soviet tracking stations used frequencies of 926 and 930 MHz. And the only gigahertz frequencies that they were capable of picking up were above 5 GHz.
Oh, this is a good one. First, Jarrah commits the fallacy of contradicting himself. Didn't he just tell us that the Soviets couldn't track their own spacecraft to the moon, and they were at the mercy of Jodrell Bank to track their lunar probes from 1959 through 1976? Now he tells us that in 1962, they built at least one 50-footer with a range of 100 million kilometers. That's more than 250 times farther than the moon. So if they had a radio telescope capable of communicating with space probes out beyond Mars, why didn't they use that radio telescope to communicate with their lunar probes that were only 385,000 kilometers away? It sounds to me that Jarrah just confirmed that from at least 1962 onward, the Soviets didn't need Jodrell Bank to track their lunar probes.
Hardly contradicting myself, I'm simply covering all the grounds. The passage from Wikipedia is no longer up. But if we go to the wiki article for the Pluton station that Webb randomly flashes on screen during his narration, we see that it says nothing about using the facility to track Apollo. In fact, reading through this article, it says the Pluton complex was used mostly for planetary radar and radio location, the process of detecting the location of planets by beaming radio waves into space, which then bounce off the surface of the said planet and back in the direction it came from. The article says that the Soviets did this for detecting the location of Mars, which Webb himself points out is within the 100 million kilometer range. That being said, I doubt we need to second guess what the 100 million kilometer range antenna was used for.
The fact that each Soviet satellite was limited to only one pair of frequencies to communicate over, one up, one down, does not imply that the Soviet ground stations could not receive transmissions from space on any other frequencies. In fact, the ground stations had to be tunable, if for no other reason than to compensate for the unwanted but inevitable frequency drift of their satellite transmitters and the Doppler shift. the change in frequency caused by the satellite's motion toward or away from the ground station.
Of course, radio telescopes are tunable, but tunable to what frequencies? To imply that any radio telescope can be tuned to any frequency on the spectrum is quite a stretch. Radio receivers are designed for specific purposes. For example, the Jodrell Bank telescope is capable of picking up all frequencies up to 5 GHz. The old Soviet RT-70 radio telescopes were designed for 5 to 300 GHz. Russia's Rantan 600, built in 1974, could only make observations between 610 MHz and 30 GHz. If Russia wanted to track Apollo, this probably would have been the telescope to use, as 2.3 GHz sits nicely within this band. Too bad the telescope came 2 years too late. Even the Pluton Complex article that Webb shows in his video states that this facility only used wavelengths of 8 SM and 30 to 40 SM. Now, I assume SM is a typo for centimetre, in which case the Pluton telescope only used frequencies of 3.7 GHz and 749 to 999 MHz. Again, nowhere near 2.3 GHz. Quite frankly, I've seen propagandists hype about how Soviets were able to track Apollo like there's no tomorrow. They love pointing to Honeysuckle Creek, Goldstone, Madrid, and whatever NASA manned spaceflight network station that they want you to believe is independent verification. Yet somehow, I'm yet to see one of them specifically say which Soviet station tracked Apollo or even provide citation. In fact, looking through Wikipedia's page on, quote, third-party evidence for Apollo, there is only one Soviet facility cited. The Soviet Union monitored the missions at the Space Transmission Corps, which was fully equipped with the latest intelligence gathering and surveillance equipment. The source of this information is Alexy Leonov's book. It refers to Apollo 11 during the touchdown and EVA alone, and this source has been proven false for as long as I can remember. As we already established, not only did none of the Russian radio telescopes use the 2 GHz used by Apollo, the Russians heavily relied on Jodrell Bank to track their own spacecrafts.
The Soviets had mustered all their technical know-how to build the probe. But to score the propaganda coup of reaching the moon first, there was one thing they lacked. They had no means of tracking Lunik all the way. No way to prove they'd really got there.
Надо было найти способ, как заставить все человеческое общество поверить в то, что мы действительно попали на Луну. И вот тогда вдруг сообразили, что есть в Англии обсерватория в Jodrell Bank. У него были хорошие остро направленные антенны, пожалуй, лучшие в мир.
Yet, Alexy Leonov, the man Russia would have you believe was the first man to walk in space, claims to have tracked Apollo 11 during descent and during the moonwalk, all from the comfort of Moscow. In 2004, Leonov wrote a book with David Scott of Gemini 8 and Apollos 9 and 15. The book was titled Two Sides of the Moon. On page 247, Leonov states,
Everything was set up at the Army Engineering Research Center, known as the Space Transmission Corps on Komsomolsky Avenue on the morning of the 21st of July 1969. The facility was fully equipped with the latest intelligence gathering and surveillance equipment. During the early hours of that morning, all television monitors and radio receivers were tuned into what was happening 250,000 miles away from our own planet. There were a few cosmonauts present, maybe 10 of us from the first group, and many senior military officers, together with intelligence experts specializing in the lunar program. The room was packed. We were all transfixed by the crackling transmissions from Apollo 11 Commander Neil Armstrong as he guided his lunar landing module Eagle down towards the surface of the moon.
Then, on page 248,
As I watched the grainy black and white images of Neil Armstrong taking his first tentative steps down the ladder of the lunar lander, it was the most amazing feeling. On the 21st of July 1969, everyone forgot for a few moments that we were all citizens of different countries on Earth. That moment really united the human race. Even in the military center where I stood, the military men were observing the achievements of our rival superpower. There was loud applause.